Yes.
Meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody. This is Timothy McAleer with my author brother, Kevin McAleer, and we're surveying all the literature we can find of significance in the last couple hundred years. Um, hey, we might go further back than that. You know, the Odyssey by Homer's the big thing everybody's interested in now. Maybe we could do a show on some of the ancient Greek, ancient Roman, or even Shakespearean literature. But for now, we're in the more modern era. And the term modern era is perfect for what we're examining. Last week, we examined a work called From Bauhaus to Our House by Tom Wolfe, Wolfe. That Wolfe. There's another Wolfe that's famous. I don't know if he spells his last name the same, but whatever. We're doing the modern Tom Wolfe. And then we also have today, we're talking about the painted word, which is about modern painting. So 2 weeks ago, we covered modern architecture through Tom Wolfe, and now we're going to cover modernist paintings from Tom Wolfe's point of view. Now, Kevin chose these two books to read and survey and talk about. I had never heard of them before, but I went out and got my copies. And this week with the painted word, I found it a little bit easier read than the From Bauhaus to Our House book. I don't know how Kevin feels about it. We haven't spoken about it. So Kevin, tell us what you thought of the painted word and how it stacks up next to the companion volume of From Bauhaus to Our House.
I think you probably found it more accessible because you have a little bit more of an understanding of Western art as opposed to Western architecture. That's certainly the case with me. You're nodding. Okay. So I found it a lot of fun. And let me just say from the outset, the little qualifier I also had at the beginning of our talk about architecture. I'm not a great art aficionado. I'm coming to you basically from Art 101 that I did take in college. I have to say, I did take an Art 101 course, the history of Western art, 2 parts. So I have the overview, but it's very much not only far back in my past, but very far back in my head. So as I was reading this, I was having to reach back for my for the various signposts that I had accumulated, not only in this history of art, Western Art 101, but over the years, going to museums and whatnot, signposts, names, masterpieces that are sort of filed away, but they don't come to consciousness too very often. I don't dwell in this realm. Okay, so
Got it.
No excuse for making any kind of mistakes here, folks. Any mispronunciations, any untoward obiter dicta. That's the person you're dealing with here. But I will say this. This is not very far away from the literature we've been dealing with in terms of its theme, because that's Wolfe's thesis, that by 1975, when he published The Painted Word, art had become completely literary, modern art, completely literary. And you ask yourself, well, so what? I mean, that is traditionally what art is. It has a literary basis. Think of all the art that has its source in biblical stories, or Roman and Greek mythology, or Shakespeare, Cervantes, the great literature of the world. Think of all the great art that has derived from that. Well, Wolfe makes a very good case for this being the great irony of modern art. that in the early 20th century, Cubism was the big movement, Fauvism, all those isms. That's precisely what they didn't like about traditional classic academic art, that it was rooted in literature, in literary sources. And you say, well, not everything is rooted in literature, Kevin. Not everything is Greek and Roman mythology or Shakespeare or the Bible. Well, they expanded the notion of literary to encompass something, and Wolfe gives this example, so I will pass it on. Something like Francois Millet's, I think it's Francois Millet, he says, The Sower. It's a famous painting of a peasant, and he's got a sack of seeds, and he's striding through his fields and tossing the seeds out into the field. And the modernists of the early 20th century, they said, this too is literature. This too is literary. Why? Because you are projecting your own little narrative on it. And what Wolfe says is, well, an example here with Millet's The Sower would be the sturdy yeoman. That myth of the sturdy yeoman and all that it implies and encompasses. So just by looking at a picture, just for 2 seconds, your mind immediately starts to work and starts to spin a narrative out of what this is. And we know this just by looking at anything, not just art. So you're sitting in a cafe, you're watching the people go by, and maybe you're with a companion. You say, look at that guy. He looks like he's just come off the oil rig, right? Look at his clothes, man. Yeah, but he strides with a certain confidence. Yeah, that's an oil rig worker. You know, you're imagining the origin story of this person. We do this all the time. When we meet someone for the first time, it doesn't have to be in a cafe or something. You meet somebody, you think, oh, who's this guy? And then your mind starts to spin stories. Well, you ask yourself now, what did the modernists have against that? It seems to be innate to human nature. If you're not going to have any stories being spun mentally or otherwise, then how are you going to do art? And they said, well, we don't want to do that any longer because it's representational. Anything that's representational, by their definition, did not come under the broad category of art for them anymore in the 20th century. Georges Braque and Picasso and these types. So anything that depicts reality, anything that is figurative, anything that goes beyond color and line for the modernists, that was a no-no. There was no longer a subject. Art was no longer about something, because all of a sudden you would start to write in your mind a story. So l'art pour l'art, right? Art for art's sake. And this was the beginning of the attempt to abandon not only the text in the postmodern sense, you know, something that you can read and analyze and lends meaning, or can be interpreted as having a meaning, but the text as a narrative. And then we get into abstract expressionism, pop art, minimalist art, conceptual art, which is then where Wolfe ends up with this opening statement in his book, which is basically my opening statement here, that in 1975 modern art had become completely literary. You end up with conceptual art, where you have documentations You have installations. You have texts accompanying the so-called art, because otherwise we don't know what to make of it. So the great irony is, within 75 years, just 3/4 of a century, things flip back to exactly what modern art had wanted to abandon in the first place.
Okay. And can you explain to us what the title "The Painted Word" refers to? It's kind of
That's it. That's it. I just explained it.
Okay.
Do you need an explanation? I thought I explained it.
I'm sorry, you made a good explanation, but I'll have to listen to it again to really have it sink in.
A little too complex, a little too convoluted, probably. Sorry about that.
You said it well, but you're dealing with some abstract concepts here. So I'd like to know just briefly
what he means by the painted word. I'll try to reduce it to simpler language.
There you go.
Is that no, I won't try to reduce it to simpler language. I'll expand, as Wolfe does in his book. So that I've basically given you the opening and ending of Wolfe's book. Now I will give you the middle and the meat.
Okay, good.
So what then happened after you had this modernist project taking off? Again, the great representative of that movement was Cubism. We all know it. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, right?
Yep.
The nude descending a staircase by Duchamp, right? We all have these in our mind's eye.
Yeah.
That was the great avant-garde movement in the first couple decades of the 20th century in the Western art world. That soon didn't become, but it evolved into, shall we say, abstract expressionism, which didn't really begin to dominate the Western art world until after the Second World War. And Wolfe puts its dates at about 1946 to 1960. So a good decade and a half. But it was picking up steam. It was emerging theoretically in the years prior. All right. Who were the theoreticians? Well, the main one is a fellow named Clement Greenberg. He was the main theoretician for abstract expressionism. And he saw a guy, Jackson Pollock, doing his thing, which another theoretician by the name of Harold Rosenberg, so Greenberg first, right, the first guy I mentioned, and then Rosenberg second. These were the two big New York art theoreticians for abstract expressionism. They both had a look at Pollock. Pollock was sort of their poster boy. And they then started laying down laws, giving out with these pronunciamentos about what abstract expressionism, which was on the cutting edge, which they hoped would be on the cutting edge of the art world very soon before it then became so. These pronunciamentos regarding how this abstract expressionism should be done. And so people who had originally inspired the likes of Greenberg and Rosenberg, like Pollock, they soon began looking over their shoulder at the theoreticians to see how they should do their work, you see?
Mm-hmm.
Hence the painted word. So the word is starting to intrude very early on in this anti-word project of modern art in the 30s and 40s. It's starting to obtrude, and the great proponents, the great exemplars of this abstract expressionism, Pollock, De Vries, Klein, Rothko.
John.
This is Wolfe's argument. they start to take their cues from the theoreticians.
Okay.
So this is a term I used back in From Our House to Bauhaus. The tail is wagging the dog once again in Mr. Wolfe's world. Okay? Hence the painted word.
Okay. So it sounds to me that theory comes first, and then art is built around that theory. Is that correct to say in this situation?
Yeah, that's the idea. In order to see the art, you first have to get the word.
That's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, so this is folks, this is for most of you out there. I include myself in that most of you out there. You go into a museum of modern art, you go into any museum with a modern art exhibit, and sometimes you ask yourself, what am I supposed to make of this?
Right.
And you may feel like a dummy. You may not. You may feel superior to it, or you're indifferent. But to make something of it, you have to read what the theoreticians have said about it. That's the whole point.
Okay.
So you can't go in just naively like someone can with a Rembrandt or a Goya. Choose your great artist in the representational school.
Yeah.
And get it. But of course, you're having to tell yourself a story. You're having to spin a narrative, and the modernists don't like that. What we'll get back to Greenberg. Greenberg's big thing was, get this, flatness. You wanted to have the painting as two-dimensional as possible. You ask yourself why. Since the Renaissance, haven't we had three-dimensionality in paintings? You know, the vanishing point, all that kind of thing.
Yep.
Well, yes, and now Mr. Greenberg, more particularly, he wants to do away with that. Why, again, you ask? Well, because for him, and this gets back to him and his like, wanting to escape painting as a narrative. For him, painting is not mimesis. Now, mimesis means you're holding a mirror up to nature. It comes from the Greek, I don't know exactly, but you're holding a mirror up to nature in the Aristotelian sense. You're reflecting reality, right? Well, anytime you're going to be reflecting so-called reality, you're going to have a subject that you will then begin to tell, if only in your mind, a story about. What also upset Mr. Greenberg was that every painting, nicely framed, had been earlier conceived as a sort of window on reality, right? But it was an illusory world, said Mr. Greenberg. We don't need that. And we don't want painting to be a handmaiden to reality. We want painting to be reality in and of itself. So what that means is no more mimesis, no more holding up a mirror to nature, no more window onto reality, an illusory one though. None of that. What we want is painting to be reality itself. We want it to be an independent object, as real as a table, as a chair. We don't want it so-called reflecting reality, and hence just two dimensions. And hence, you make that thing as flat as possible. We don't want the illusion of three-dimensionality, of an alternative reality. This is reality here, this thing itself, l'art pour l'art. This is what we want to focus on. So flatness, two-dimensionality. That's it.
So in that case, isn't Jasper John's so-called painting of an American flag the ideal piece of art for this way of thinking? It's very two-dimensional. It's very flat. It's the flag up on, it looks like it's pinned up on a wood background of some sort. I forget what the name of that painting is. Does he just call it the American flag? But does that fulfill what you're saying is necessary for these artists? Flatness?
Absolutely. And that's where we have a third art critic coming into play. His name is, all right, folks, it's going to be a little bit complicated at this point, but Leo Steinberg. I keep them in order, basically alphabetically. So you have Clement Greenberg, G, you have Harold Rosenberg, R, and then you have Leo Steinberg, S. Okay, so those are the three big critics. The Berg boys. In the Berg, by the way, they're all from New York, right? This is another argument that Wolfe makes, which he doesn't like too much. He doesn't like the fact, although he was a New Yorker himself, he doesn't like the fact that New York, in America at very least, was the overlord of the art ecosystem.
Yes,
right?
It's true.
Ever since the 20s up until when he's writing in 1975. And in fact, he talks about how everything we're discussing in our little book readers, the art world, it only consists of about 10,000 people tops. The artists, the museum curators, the collectors, of course, the arts councils, the museum boards, and did I say the artists? Did I say the artists? I said the artists, but I should have said them last, because these people call the shots, right? The aforementioned, they call the shots, and these various entities jockeying for position in New York, the Big Apple. There are 7 other cities. I think I have them memorized here because they're very famous cities. He said there's 7 other cities, again, writing in 1975, that lord it over the art world. So New York, Paris, London, Rome, Milan, and 3 German cities, Berlin, Munich, and Dusseldorf. I think there's some kind of big museum in Dusseldorf. But so those are the 8, and they consist of about 10,000 people, and that's it. So we, the public, when we go in, to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, I did that one time. It was a fun experience. We are being presented with stuff that we have not voted for, either literally or with our dollar bills or our tax money, but we are doing it with our feet by patronizing these museums. But we are not of this world. We are just privy to it through what they give us, right? So the great unwashed, they are bestowed these works, whether we like them or not. It's very similar again to the From Our House to Bauhaus, how the powers that be, which was basically the architects at the time, Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, and the like, they're basically dictating design to the money men, to the capitalists. So this is the situation. This is the art world. And back to Steinberg, Leo Steinberg, he saw this big exhibition of Jasper Johns in 1958, think February, in New York, some gallery. And people like Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, his forerunners, the great proponents of abstract expressionism, they thought, this is anathema, this is hearsay. Well, why? Well, because it's representational. It's a flag. Flat, yes, but a flag. He also had in his gallery exhibition of 1958, he also had archery targets and rows of numbers and letters of the alphabet. So all flat. But Harold and Clement didn't go for that because we can tell ourselves a story. We don't want any of that. But Leo Steinberg thought this was fine. Okay? He thought it was fine because, as you say, these are flat by very nature. And I can actually read something to you. And this is where we can finally get a little bit of Wolfe's prose in. The central arguing point of Steinberg regarding Johns, the central arguing point was, in fact, flatness. The new theory went as follows. Johns had chosen real subjects such as flags and numbers and letters and targets that were flat by their very nature. They were born to be flat, you might say. Thereby, Johns was achieving an amazing thing. He was bringing real subjects into modern painting, but in a way that neither violated the law of flatness nor introduced literary content. On the contrary, he was converting pieces of everyday communication, flags and numbers, into art objects, and thereby deliteralizing them. Were they content or were they form? They were neither. They were a higher synthesis. An amazing result, said Steinberg. Then Steinberg noticed something else. Johns had covered his flat signs in short, choppy, Cézanne-like brushstrokes. Somehow this made them look flatter than ever. In fact, his flatness exposed once and for all the pseudo-flatness of abstract expressionists like Kooning and Pollock. De Kooning and Pollock. The jig was up. Steinberg was now ready to give the coup de grace to Clement Greenberg. Greenberg had always argued that the old masters, the classic 3D realists, had created, quote, an illusion of space into which one could imagine oneself walking, unquote. Whereas, to the everlasting glory of modernism, you couldn't walk into a modernist painting, and least of all into an abstract expressionist painting. Just a minute, said Steinberg. That's all well and good. But you're talking about a, quote, pre-industrial standard of locomotion, unquote, i.e., walking. Perhaps you can't walk into an abstract expressionist painting, but you can fly through. Right. You could take a spaceship. Just look at a de Kooning or a Rothko or a Franz Klein. Look at that airy quality, those, quote, areas floating in space, unquote, those cloud formations, all that, quote, illusionistic space, unquote, with its evocations of intergalactic travel. Why, you could sail through a de Kooning in a Mercury capsule or a Soyuz any day in the week. All along, the abstract expressionists had been dealing in, quote, open atmospheric effects, unquote. It was aerial double dealing, and it did, quote, clearly deny and dissemble the picture's material surface, unquote, and nobody had ever blown the whistle on them. Well, it was all now blown for abstract expressionism. And then Next page, a little bit later on, Wolfe ends with, "How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? That was once a question of infinite subtlety. Ah, yes, but consider, can a spaceship penetrate a de Kooning?" So there's a lot of casuistry. There's a lot of sophistry, call it what you will, but there's a lot of semantic wordplay going on. Key word play to define what is good or bad art. So John's got a pass, even if he was representing subjects. He got a pass from a big art critic at the time, namely this Leo Steinberg, and pop art with Robert Rauschenberg and his comic strips blown up, but flat.
Flat. And Andy Warhol.
Got underway, and then you had the likes of Warhol with his Campbell soup cans and Brillo boxes, which was sort of dopey, kind of campy fun, which was sort of the allure also, Wolfe mentions, of pop art after this high moral seriousness of abstract expressionism all these years, which had followed the high moral seriousness of social realism in the 1930s, right? When you had sort of a hiatus between the development of modern art and its accompanying concepts, where there was sort of a hiatus during the Depression when everything was turned to, the Marxist agenda and art in its cause as a form of propaganda. So there was a hiatus during the Depression up until 1941 is the year that Wolfe gives when the United States entered the Second World War. This was a reprieve from all that, the pop art. Finally, we're having a little fun. And what is also important here, this takes up a good third, the first third of Wolfe's book, is he talks about something he calls the boho dance. And the pop art guys, Johns, Rauschenberg, Warhol, et al., they were masters of the boho dance. What was the boho dance? The boho dance was having one foot in your bohemian, the meaning of boho, avant-garde, cutting edge, épate la bourgeoisie, shock the bourgeoisie, world, Greenwich Village world in New York. You had one foot in that, but you had your other foot in high society. You're being invited to all the best parties. You're coming to the openings of galleries, exhibitions at MoMA. You're occupying both these worlds, right? What you're getting out of it is obvious. You're getting fame and money as an artist. And what your patrons are getting is the prestige of art, patronage. There's a certain prestige attached to that. And also a term that Wolfe uses in another book that I have of his. It's called Radical Chic and Mowing the Flatcatchers. The first part of that book is basically about Leonard Bernstein, Tim, and his wife. What was her name? Felicia? I forget.
Felicia, yeah.
How they one time hosted a party as a fundraiser for the legal fees for the Black Panthers. And you had all these Black Panther types showing up at Leonard Bernstein's apartment. I think it's in the early 70s, I think, because they were going up. I think Huey Newton was on I think it was Huey Newton's case where he was up for murder. He was for murder charges. Whatever it was, Black Panthers were always in some kind of trouble with the law. They had this party, and Wolfe attended. And it's hilarious. You have they're basically, you got all these New York aesthetes and society women rubbing elbows with these big, tough ghetto guys, And there's a great phrase that Wolfe uses to describe what's going on here. He calls it, it's in the title, radical chic, right? You, the moneyed classes, you have the perspicacity to know what's cool, what's in, what's chic. And he uses another phrase from the French. So there's a lot of French phrases going on in this book. We're now back to the painted word. But the phrase that he took from radical chic is nostalgie de la boue, which basically translates as the romanticization of the primitive, right? Having a certain sentimental attitude toward filth. La boue is mud in French. It's basically slumming, but you're cooler for it. Your status in the Weberian sense ascends the scale because of your nostalgie de la boue. He could have used this phrase in talking about what happened with the types like Warhol, Rauschenberg, and Johns in the 60s. They were consummating the boho dance, right? To court the moneyed classes at the same time as they kind of made fun of them, if only in an oblique way. At any rate, making fun of them by virtue of the motto that they carried on their figurative pennants, which was épate la bourgeoisie. Now we go back to earlier in the 40s and 50s, when the abstract expressionists were attempting to consummate the boho dance. And the master of this was Pablo Picasso. And I will read a passage now. Picasso is a case in point. Picasso did not begin to become Picasso in the art world or in the press until he was pushing 40 and painted the scenery for Diaghilev's Russian ballet in London in 1918. Diaghilev and co. were a tremendous succès de scandale in fashionable London. The wild dervishing of Nijinsky, the lurid costumes, it was all too deliciously modern for words. The modernistic settings by Picasso, André Derain, and later on Matisse, were all part of the excitement, and Le Monde loved it. Le Monde meaning the people, the in crowd. Art, in Osbert Lancaster's phrase, came once more to roost among the duchesses. Picasso, who had once lived in the legendary unlit attic and painted at night with a brush in one hand and a candlestick in the other. Picasso now stayed at the Savoy, had lots of clothes made on Bond Street and nearby, including a set of tails, went to all the best parties, and parties were never better, was set up with highly publicized shows of his paintings, and became a social lion, which he remained, tales of the aging recluse notwithstanding, until he was in his 70s. Back in Paris, the new Picasso turned up at the theater with his kid gloves, canes, tall hats, capes, and dinner clothes, and the linings gave you a little silk flash every time he wheeled about in the lobby to chat with one of his hellish new friends, our old pal Braque, Georges Braque, who helped to found the Cubist movement. At least Duran had, okay, our old pal Brock shook his head sadly. At least Duran had the decency to confine himself to a blue serge suit when he was being lionized in London, and he had stuck to the company of local bohos in his off hours. But Picasso, Brock was like that incorruptible member of the Cénacle, of the Rue des Quatre Vents, Daniel d'Artel, watching the decay of Lucien Chardon and Balzac's Lost Illusions. Wolfe loves Balzac because he sees him as a great social historian. With a sigh, Brock waited for his old comrade Pablo's imminent collapse as a painter and human being, but the damnedest thing happened instead. Picasso just kept ascending to El Dorado, to tremendous wealth, but to much more than that, to the sainted status of Picasso, to the point where by 1950 he was known at every level of opinion, from art news to the Daily News, as the painter of the 20th century. As for Duran and his blue serge suit, and Brock and his scruples, the two old boys, both very nearly the same age as Picasso, i.e. about 70, were remembered in 1950, chiefly as part of the pit crew during Picasso's monumental victory. Not to beg the question of difference in talent, but here we have the classic demonstration of the artist who knows how to double track his way from the boho dance to the consummation, as opposed to the artist who gets stuck forever in the boho dance. This is an ever-present hazard of the art mating ritual. Now, that was an extended passage, but it's very important for Wolfe in his explanation of how we have this art today that we may or may not like, but it's in the museums.
Well, that was a pretty dramatic reading you gave there.
Wolfe is a dramatic writer. I can read him all day. He's sheer fireworks. He is one of the writers, and this is not to say that I'm such the great writer, but he is one of the few writers I read and I think, I really would like to write a little bit more like Wolfe. Very few writers at this point in my writing career where I say that. It's like, I have my style, I'm happy with it, I think it does the job. But he's a guy you think he does the job plus, plus, plus. He really gets across his ideas. He's got a very vital, colorful prose. And yeah, you use the right word, very dramatic, very dynamic.
Okay, so you read 2 passages so far. Are there any other passages that we might want to touch upon before we start winding this up?
Those are 2 good examples. I don't want to bore, we're not going to bore them, but I don't want to just rely on Wolfe any longer. Maybe at the end, I think we got about, 15 minutes? I will. Yeah. We could just continue talking a little bit more about this whole idea of the painted word.
Okay, I have a question concerning that. One of the Bergs, you had 3 Bergs there as critics. I can't differentiate from them very well from one another, but maybe you can. You've written down some notes, it seems. One of them said something to the effect of, and I might be misquoting it, but they said, your first impression of a painting must always be that it is ugly. And then eventually you'll come around to seeing some kind of, who said that line? Do you remember that?
That was our first Berg, Clement Greenberg.
And can you quote it again properly?
I got a nice passage for that, actually.
Oh.
And yeah, let me see. Yes, okay, I think I got it.
You got it?
Yeah, right. This is a great excuse for any art, isn't it? it's heads you win, tails you
I lose. Yeah.
You win, tails you lose. Right? Because if it's ugly, it's terrible, then it must be great. If it's great, then who's going to argue with that? It's great.
If it's ugly, it's great. Yeah.
If it's great, it's great. It's ugly, it's great. You're just great. You're an artist. You're a boho god. You're doing the deed. You're living the life. Yeah.
Give me the passage.
Yeah. Here it is. And I think this is regarding. Yes. So Greenberg said this. first of all. Our first Berg,
Okay.
Clement Greenberg. If it's ugly, it's great.
He's basically saying
there's good reason to think it's great because it's not on your aesthetic compass yet. It's gone beyond what you have been exposed to see, that you have learned, that you have been inculcated with thinking is great. So because you think it's ugly, odds are, pal, especially if I, Clement Greenberg, say so, it's great. If the theory says it's great, then, what are you going to do? So this is Steinberg, however. So we had Greenberg, we have Mr. Harold Rosenberg. We haven't done much with Mr. Rosenberg, but he was the big proponent of Jackson Pollock, action painting as process. Okay, a picture is not a picture; it's an event. All right, that's Harold Rosenberg, kind of in a nutshell.
Right.
And now we come to Leo Steinberg, who was a big pop art guy. So Steinberg said, this is Wolfe now writing, the clincher about pop art being great, the clincher was Steinberg's own confession of how he had at first disliked John's work. He had resisted it. He had fought to cling to his old values and then realized he was wrong. This filtered down as a kind of turbulence theorem. If a work of art or a new style disturbed you, it was probably good work. If you hated it, it was probably great. That's enough.
That's it.
I was going to read some more. But you can't surpass that final line.
So he's basically saying any profound artwork is going to be ugly at first, but you'll get around to appreciating it one way or another.
Because you don't understand it. You have to understand it. And for that, you need the text. You need the theory.
Well,
you need the word. The word painted is something other than the word itself. You need the word. And this is the funniest aspect of the whole book here. We're getting more into wordplay, more into narratives, more into print media even, because you would go to these installations, these concept art exhibits, and you would have the walls would be covered with texts telling you what it is and how to think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was in my master's degree courses about 15 years ago at CSUN, I took a class called, I believe it was called Stylistics, and they were talking about how everything is a text. Everything. A license plate on the back of the car is a text. Baking instructions for some food you might want to eat is a text. The recipe is a text. The sun and the stars are a text. When you see them, you derive meaning. Every human being is a text that when we first meet them, we read them. And so I learned in graduate school that everything is a text. And these paintings are text, whether you like it or not, right? Eventually they all become the painted word.
Well, that's the postmodern read of things, right? That's Foucault, that's Derrida, that's Roland Barthes.
Right.
That everything is a text, not only things, but events, wedding ceremonies, courtroom dramas. My own baby, a duel, is a text. And in 1994, when I published my book, Princeton University Press, available at fine bookstores near you folks, still after 32 years. Still getting royalties on it, by the way, truly. Being taught at universities, I have to toot my horn here once in a while. I don't want to always play the modest, obscure little writer. But I was doing this sort of postmodern analysis of the dual as a text.
Oh.
In other words, the meanings, spoken and unspoken, performed, the dual as a performative text. I was doing this without even knowing the jargon. It was just my innate innate appeal of interpreting these events. I guess I'd read a lot of the sports page when I was a kid, and you'd have guys like Jim Murray doing deep dives into a game, right? They tell you what's going on beyond that. They'd make historical references, draw all kinds of metaphors, and I was doing this avant la lettre, at least in my own mind, right? So a text is basically anything that can be read and interpreted in terms of its meaning, its cultural, historical, and social meaning. And the difference between a text and a narrative, because I've been using the word narrative quite a bit, is that a text may or may not have a narrative. That is to say, a beginning, a middle, and end, a story you tell about it, right? To have it make sense. So there's a slight difference there. But yes, everything, by the time we have abstract expressionism having long established itself in the 40s and 50s, and then pop art, and then minimalist art, and then conceptual art, then we have these postmodern guys coming along, and they're talking about everything as a text. So there's sort of a dovetailing between the sociological / philosophical world and the art world.
Well,
even if neither of the twain did meet, I don't know, probably, because they were all in these big cities where the big art was happening. Paris, New York. Paris and New York, I think, primarily would be the two ones where you might have Derrida rubbing shoulders with a Leo Steinberg.
well said. And there's an interesting quote from the 19th century, I believe it was, from Auguste Comte, Comte, who was a French philosopher. He had an expression that all ideas. Wait, what was that one? No, he said ideas rule the world, and they bring either order or chaos. Did these ideas that are ruling the world, at least the art world of the time, from New York and Greenwich Village, are they ruling the world? And are they bringing chaos, or are they bringing order to things? What would you say to that?
Well, my question would be, are they bringing beauty to it? Because that's, for me, what art is. Let me just tell you this, folks. When I have been, for a complete cultural Philistine, I have been around to a fair number of art museums, because when I was in graduate school and just hitting Europe for the first time, I did my due diligence. I went around to every big or little museum you could imagine in a lot of the capitals: Paris, Madrid, the Prado, Munich, the Alte Neue Pinakothek, Berlin, of course, millions of museums, other places. But I did go to see a lot of art. And I have to say, having said that, or having posed the rhetorical question, are they bringing more beauty into the world as opposed to truth or order? I didn't much care about the beauty part. What I cared about, and now we bring back the painted word into the discussion, what I cared about was, in fact, the story. I would go and look at the Rembrandt, right, in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I would go and see the Night Watch I hope it's there. I think it was there. The Night Watch by Rembrandt.
Yeah.
And I would sit there and not admire the technique or the composition or the color or the form. I would imagine the stories of these 17th century Dutch burghers. I would look into their faces. I would look at their clothes. I would think, how did they live? Did they pose for this? I don't even know. Maybe someone could tell me. Did they pose? Were they posed for this? Probably not. I don't know. But how did this? What's the history behind the painting? What was going through Rembrandt's mind when he was putting this motley crew together for one of the great works of art acknowledged in history? I was spinning out tales in my mind, and this is my own narrative instinct. That's why I'm a writer. That's why I did history. I like to think of the story behind, well, the story, as it were, the story behind the painting, this artifact, and that's how I approach everything. When I read a book, I won't, if it's new to me, I won't read the introduction. If it's a classic, for example, you read Henry James, The Ambassadors, and there's a long introduction by someone who's a Henry James expert. That's the last thing I want to read. I want to read it for myself. And I will read the introduction, if at all, at the end of the book. I think you do the same thing. And so that's how I go still into museums. I never read the text. I want to see how it strikes me. And here I'm getting to my point, and we can end with this. We're right at the top of the hour. I am most unhappy with the development that modern art has taken, because to understand it, I have to read the text. I have to read the theory. I'm anti-theory. In this sense, I'm anti-text. Art for me is the impression I get when I stand in front of the painting. So I love this book. It spoke to me at this visceral level that I've just described, how I experience art. And I can only recommend it to lovers of art, haters of art, anyone who is at all passionate about art.
Very well said. That's a good ending. We are now at the top of the hour, as you said, so we must go. But I appreciate your insights. It is an interesting text, and I also would recommend it to anyone, although there's some concepts and theories in there that you sometimes aren't able to wrap your mind around immediately, but stick with it. You'll eventually get it, especially if you watch this video. So,
I think so. I dare say. I think so.
Oh, I dare say. Thank you, Kev. You were an excellent art theorist today, on top of analyzing the literature. I appreciate it.
I make so bold as to pretend that I have conveyed the essence of Mr. Wolfe, because, as I said at the top, this is not affectation. I am not at all an art expert. I just took this at face value, and I'm giving it back to you what I understood by it. And I think you guys kind of get it at this point.
All right. Excellent, Kev. We'll see you next time, okay?
Right. See you later.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.